Putin called a meeting of his top economists to explain why Russia's GDP is collapsing. His explanation: January had 2 fewer Tuesdays than last year. We are not making that up. That is the official position of the leader of a nuclear superpower. GDP down, manufacturing down, construction down, oil revenues nearly cut in half. And the man responsible called his economists in not to admit the war is destroying the economy, but to ask why the calendar let him down. The Kremlin spent 4 years hiding this. Putin just handed it to us in a single meeting. Here's exactly what the numbers actually say. Let's start with exactly what Putin said, because the words matter. Statistics show that economic growth has unfortunately been declining for 2 months in a row. Overall, GDP contracted by 1.8% between January and February. That came directly from Putin at a meeting on economic issues, reported by Interfax. Not a Western think tank, not a Ukrainian briefing. The Kremlin's own readout. Now, 1.8% might not sound catastrophic in isolation. Here's why it is. In 2023, Russia's GDP grew over 4%. In 2024, it grew close to 5%. War economy stimulus, military spending flooding the system, energy revenues covering the gaps. The Kremlin was using those numbers like a propaganda shield. Growth is growth. The sanctions aren't working. Russia is fine. Then 2025 arrived and growth dropped to 1%. 1%. After 2 years of 4+, the shield was already cracking. Now we're at negative 1.8%, and Putin is in a room asking his economists why the numbers are below expectations, including, he noted pointedly, below the government's own forecasts and below the central bank's projections. The Russian Academy of Sciences, which is not exactly a hotbed of anti-Kremlin dissent, says Q1 2026 will show a year-on-year decline of 1.5%. The central bank, meanwhile, is forecasting 1.6% growth for the same period. 2 Russian institutions, completely opposite readings. One of them is lying, and it probably isn't the one without a direct line to the presidential administration. Somebody is massaging the figures. One of them answers to markets. The other answers to Putin. Draw your own conclusions. Let's spend exactly the amount of time this deserves on Putin's calendar defense, which is not much. 3 fewer working days in January and February. That's the explanation offered for a 1.8% GDP contraction in the world's largest country by land area, with the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and what Putin keeps telling us is an economy that has successfully absorbed 4 years of Western sanctions. The UK, and nobody is putting the UK forward as an economic miracle right now, recorded 0.1% growth in January and 0.5% in February. The US, Japan, the G7 as a whole, all recording modest but positive figures in the 0.1 to 0.3% range. Did every other country on Earth somehow receive the 3 extra working days that Russia missed? The economists in that room had a choice. They could say, Vladimir, the war you started is consuming capital, labor, and industrial capacity faster than the economy can regenerate any of them. Or they could nod and write it down. They wrote it down. Some of them presumably went home and had a very large drink. Now here's the moment where Putin tried to pivot to good news and accidentally made things worse. Currently, unemployment stands at 2.1%. Putin announced, presented as a bright spot, a sign of labor market resilience, flexible, platform-based employment developing, very encouraging. Here is what a 2.1% unemployment rate actually means in Russia in 2026. It means the country has run out of workers. Russia entered this war already facing a demographic crisis that predates Putin's invasion by decades. Falling birth rates, aging population, net emigration of working-age people accelerated dramatically after February 2022, when an estimated 500,000 to 800,000 Russians, many of them educated and professionally skilled, left the country in the first months of the invasion alone. Layer on top of that 4 years of military mobilization pulling working-age men out of factories, construction sites, and transport networks. The exact casualty figures are contested, We're not going to throw unverified numbers at you. What is not contested is this. Russia's own central bank governor Elvira Nabiullina called it an unprecedented labor shortage. Her words, the head of Russia's own central bank. So when Putin points to 2.1% unemployment as evidence things are working, what he's actually describing is a labor market so depleted that companies are fighting each other for whatever workers are left. Businesses are being forced to raise wages to compete for staff. Higher wages push up production costs. Higher production costs push up prices. And suddenly the labor shortage is not just an economic footnote. It is the primary driver of inflation in a country already dealing with an interest rate of 21%. For context, the Bank of England's rate that caused near panic in UK mortgage markets in 2023 peaked at 5.25%. People were genuinely renegotiating their lives over 5.25%. Russia's rate has hovered between 15 and 21%, a level that would cause a total banking collapse in any Western economy. And the central bank says it isn't coming down anytime soon. A 2.1% unemployment rate is not a success story. It's a distress signal with the volume turned down. And the competition for those remaining workers isn't just between Russian companies. Russia's military recruitment apparatus is fishing from the same shrinking pool. Sign-on bonuses have been raised repeatedly to attract volunteers. Russia was bringing in roughly 800 new contract soldiers per day in Q1 2026, down sharply from prior periods and below what most analysts think is needed to replace losses at the current rate. The army and the factory are now bidding against each other for the same man. The factory is losing, so increasingly is the army. Let's talk about where the money is going, and more importantly, where it isn't coming from. Russia's federal budget revenues for Q1 2026 were 8.2% lower than the same period in 2025. Expenditures jumped 17%. The Q1 deficit came in at 4.58 trillion rubles, roughly $60 billion. That figure has already exceeded Russia's planned deficit for the entire year. 3 months gone. The Kremlin has been trying to paper over the gap by taxing non-energy businesses harder. VAT increases, excise taxes, additional levies across multiple sectors. The result of all that extra squeezing, 7% more revenue from non-energy sources. 7% more revenue from businesses that are already understaffed, already cutting hours, already watching demand fall. Russia taxed struggling companies harder and got a 7% return on that aggression. Meanwhile, the hole that needed filling was driven by oil and gas revenues collapsing 45.4% compared to Q1 2025. 45.4%, nearly half. Energy is not a side story for Russia's budget. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies puts oil and gas taxation at between 30% and 50% of federal revenues in normal years. When that pillar drops by nearly half, no amount of additional VAT on struggling manufacturers covers it. Russia suspended gold and foreign currency transactions until July 1st. That is not the action of a country with comfortable fiscal headroom. That is a country buying itself time while it figures out which bill it can afford not to pay. Now, there is a number Russia points to that looks like good news, and in fairness, it briefly was. The US military operation against Iran created a partial blockade situation around the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil and LNG flows through that waterway. Supply disruption meant prices spiked. Oil hovering around $100 a barrel. Russia, selling at a discount through its shadow fleet, still got more per barrel than it had been getting. Reuters reported Russia's main oil tax revenue would roughly double to around $9 billion in April alone. That is real money. We're not going to pretend otherwise. But here is what Russia's own think tank CMASF said about it. It's a band-aid on a gaping wound. Even at elevated prices, the best-case scenario adds about 0.5% to Russia's 2026 growth. capping total growth at around 1.3%. That's the optimistic scenario, and it depends entirely on a geopolitical situation Russia has no control over whatsoever. The moment the US and Iran reach any kind of agreement, the moment Hormuz reopens, oil prices fall back, and Russia is straight back into a fiscal hole without the temporary cushion. The windfall isn't structural, it's situational, and the situation can change with a phone call between Washington and Tehran that Russia isn't in the room for. Betting your national budget on a Middle East standoff you didn't start and can't influence is not a strategy. Abstract economic numbers are one thing. Here's what it looks like at ground level. KAMAZ, Russia's largest truck manufacturer, a flagship of Soviet-era industrial pride that Putin's government has always been keen to photograph and point at when discussing Russian manufacturing capability. KAMAZ has moved to a 4-day work week, not for the first time. They did it in summer 2025 too, because the Russian heavy truck market shrank 40% in the first 2 months of 2026. 40% in 2 months. When Russia's flagship truck company is working 4 days a week because there aren't enough orders to justify a fifth, the war economy argument, the idea that military demand is sustaining Russian industry, starts to look considerably less convincing. Avtovaz, Russia's largest car manufacturer, has halted production in certain lines. Uralvagonzavod, Russia's main tank manufacturer, the company that is theoretically running a war effort, announced mass layoffs last November that cut staff in some units by 50%. A tank factory cutting staff during an active war. State television has not yet found a dignified way to cover this. They are working on it. In Leningrad, 8 enterprises stopped production entirely in recent months, with another 16 cutting schedules. These are not the moves companies make when they have too many orders. These are the moves companies make when the orders stopped arriving, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Construction output fell 16% year-on-year in January, then another 14% in February. Manufacturing output fell 2.9%. Cargo transport turnover in February hit its lowest level since the height of the COVID pandemic in 2020. Retail is stagnant. Wage growth has slowed from 13.5% across 2025 to 8% in February 2026, which sounds less alarming until you remember inflation is running hot and the central bank's rate is 21%. And then there's Oleg Deripaska, one of Russia's wealthiest oligarchs and a man with close Kremlin ties, pushing for 12-hour, 6-day work weeks as his solution to the productivity problem. When the billionaires start publicly demanding their workers grind harder because the system is straining, the system is straining. Russia's economic problems did not start in February 2022. They were already there. Harvard's Davis Center researchers Vasily Burov and Andrei Yakovlev put it cleanly in a Moscow Times piece. Russia chose guns over butter long before the invasion. For years, Putin's system has concentrated wealth among regional elites, Kremlin-connected businesses, and a small oligarchic layer, while chronically underinvesting in social services, infrastructure, and the kind of institutional development that creates genuine long-term growth. What the war did was not create those problems. It accelerated them. And more importantly, it exposed them. The demographic crisis was already running before 2022. The labor shortage was already building. The overdependence on energy revenues was a vulnerability the IMF, the World Bank, and Russia's own economic institutions had been flagging for years before a single soldier crossed the border. The invasion took all of those slow-moving problems and put them on a wartime timeline. And this is where the political trap closes. Putin is now in a room asking economists for solutions, but the solution to a labor shortage partly caused by military casualties is to stop generating military casualties. The solution to a budget crisis, partly driven by war expenditure, is to stop the war expenditure. The solution to an economy hollowed out by the concentration of wealth among Kremlin insiders is to restructure the Kremlin insider economy. None of those solutions are available to Putin, not politically, not personally, not without dismantling the system that keeps him in power. So instead, he asks for reports, and the economists write things down, and the calendar gets blamed. And here's the detail that should concern the Kremlin more than any of of the economic figures. Ilya Remezlo, not a liberal dissident, not a Western-funded critic, but a longtime pro-Kremlin commentator, published a piece titled 5 Reasons I Stopped Supporting Vladimir Putin. He was subsequently placed in a psychiatric facility. One case, not a revolution. But when the regime starts sending its own supporters to psychiatric wards for saying what the economic data already shows, the information war has entered a different phase. The Kremlin can suppress opposition, it's considerably harder to suppress its own GDP figures. The war economy model: flood the system with military spending, use energy revenues to cover the gaps, suppress dissent, repeat, worked while energy prices were high and the labor pool was intact. Both of those conditions are now degrading at the same time. The military spending hasn't stopped. The labor pool keeps shrinking. The energy revenues are wobbling. The interest rate needed to fight inflation is itself strangling investment and growth. This is what economists call a squeeze. Every lever Russia could pull to ease pressure in one area makes pressure worse somewhere else. Cut rates to stimulate growth, inflation gets worse, raise taxes to cover the deficit. Businesses cut more hours, increase military spending. Labor market gets tighter, reduce military spending. The war narrative collapses. There is no clean exit from a multiple crisis stack. There is only management, delay, and hoping something external changes in your favor. This is what ripping apart from the inside actually looks like. Not a battlefield collapse, not a dramatic press conference. A squeeze that gets tighter every month while the man in charge asks the calendar why it let him down. Russia is currently hoping, very loudly, while blaming the calendar. The war did not break Russia. Russia was already cracked. The war found every crack and leaned on it. A country that built its modern identity around energy abundance, military prestige, and the raw, intimidating weight of scale is now running short of workers. Watching its industrial flagships cut to 4-day weeks, staring at a budget deficit that blew through its annual ceiling in 3 months, and listening to its leader explain that GDP fell because February was short. Putin asked his economists for answers. They'll produce a report. The report will be optimistic in the ways it needs to be optimistic. It will recommend things that sound structural and technocratic. It will not say the one thing that every person in that room already knows. The problem is the war. The solution is ending it, and the man asking the questions is the man who started it.